The tragedy of Gallipoli so shook the nations of Australia and New Zealand that for a century it's cast a giant shadow over what happened next. And what happened next cost the lives of 5 times as many ANZACs as Gallipoli, and they died here.
I'm Neil Piggott, an actor whose family has served in nearly every conflict since World War I, which has left me with a lifelong passion for military history.
This was the main theatre of the First World War. This was the only place where the war could be won. And what happened here changed us and the world.
I'm Dr. Peter Pedersen, military historian, former Australian Army Battalion Commander and former Assistant Director of the Australian War Memorial.
In this series, we'll find out by analysing the tactics
In our operations room, by walking the battlefields, putting the commanders under scrutiny, and hearing the voices of the original diggers, we'll learn how the real legend of ANZAC was forged here
on the Western Front.
It's the summer of 1914 and the modern age is flexing its muscles. The continent of Europe is being swept up with nationalism, socialism, anarchism, liberalism, and great global empires are governed from its capital cities. But it's also a dangerous time, a time of increasing political instability.
2 great competing power blocks, Germany and its ally Austria-Hungary on one side, and on the other, France, Britain and Russia faced each other, and war seemed increasingly likely. It came in August 1914.
Because of Britain and Europe's overseas possessions and America's eventual entry into the war, they came from around the globe, transforming what began as a continental conflict into a world war. And when it erupted, it swept up the young nations of Australia and New Zealand and marked forever the way we think about ourselves.
The spirit of the ANZAC was born on Gallipoli, but it was to be baptised on the bloodiest, costliest battlefield on which Australian and New Zealand soldiers have ever fought.
This is the story of a battlefield little more than half the size of Tasmania, where almost 46,000 Australians and 12,000 New Zealanders died.
A story that starts with their arrival here, on the battlefield where the war would be won or lost. Germany was fighting on 2 fronts. To the east, it faced Russia. So this was the Western Front, entrenched positions that stretched about 750 kilometres from the North Sea to the Alps. The German military planners knew they had to beat the French first and quickly. Then Germany could deal with Russia before the Russians had fully mobilised their vast manpower reserves.
And the French thought the Germans were going to attack on their common highly fortified frontier here at Alsace and Lorraine. But the German High Command wanted rapid movement, not fighting bogged down in front of heavily defended positions. So they launched a powerful wheeling attack through neutral Luxembourg, neutral Belgium, and into the heart of France.
But the objectives proved too ambitious, so the German High Command had to water them down. And that gave the French, on whose forces the German attack overwhelmingly fell, an opportunity to derail it.
Now, the French took appalling casualties, didn't they, Peter?
As many as 250,000 casualties, with 80,000 dead in just 2 months.
But they held the line here at the River Marne, and the Germans stopped just 80 kilometres from Paris, were forced to dig in.
As a result, the war developed into a series of attempted outflanking manoeuvres, which was dubbed the Race to the Sea, and as each move failed, the front was extended. So by the end of 1914, static defensive positions had been established across Europe. The United Kingdom, separated from Europe by the English Channel, had no reason to fear a continental war, which is why they had a very small professional army. For this reason, the German High Command and the Kaiser didn't expect Britain to become involved. But Britain's empire and wealth was based on maritime supremacy, and as such, it was not protected by soldiers, but by the Royal Navy.
And it was partly to defend its maritime supremacy that Britain deployed the 7 divisions of its expeditionary force to where they could keep the vital channel ports out of German hands.
And to their south, across the Western Front, more than 100 French divisions, well over 1 million men, faced the Germans.
Dominion troops, including the ANZACs and other Empire troops, were added to the order of battle of the British Expeditionary Force, and so they came to the northern end of the line. They came to Picardy and to Flanders.
What happened on this battlefield was dictated by one simple fact. The German advance had been halted, but the Germans hadn't been repelled. Germany couldn't win the war unless it exposed itself by going on the attack, but it couldn't lose the war so long as it resisted the attempts of the French and her allies to dislodge it. It was a stalemate, and that is what made the Western Front the decisive theatre of the First World War.
Military thinking on all sides had for centuries been based on the idea of the decisive battle. But once the Western Front was set, that didn't happen until the last months of the war.
The sheer weight of munitions and the number of men meant that the Western Front wasn't about decisive battles of movement or territorial gain, it was about attrition. The winner would be the side that could afford to fire the most shells, or effectively afford to lose the most men. The weapons of the 20th century, magazine-loading rifles, machine guns, long-range artillery and, of course, barbed wire, favoured the defender. As a consequence, few wars have seen such rapid development and incredible expansion in the type of weapons employed.
Tanks, poison gas, flamethrowers all appeared on the battlefield. Motor vehicles and light railways transported men, supplies and equipment, and wireless was used to communicate.
And in the skies above the Western Front, aircraft would appear, initially used for observation. They'd be armed and become effective weapons.
Soon the term line of trenches was an inadequate description. There was the front line trench, the support line trench just behind it, and a network of communication trenches linking the two. Further back, there was the reserve trench, and further back still, there could be a second line, which would be garrisoned in an emergency. In the trenches, there were dugouts, there were concrete pillboxes, and in some places, even underground bunkers with electricity laid on.
And in front of those trenches, one of the most effective weapons of the war. Miles and miles of this stuff, barbed wire.
And throughout 1915, while the ANZACs were fighting on Gallipoli, it became increasingly fortified. And this is the battlefield the Australians and New Zealanders entered in early 1916.
The ANZACs have just come from the harsh landscape of Gallipoli. They're being transported up here through green fields. Everything looks familiar. What do you think their expectations were?
They were exhilarated. The move north was so refreshing for them. It was lush, verdant, the green was such a contrast with parched yellow landscape of ANZAC.
And life behind the lines here was completely different to ANZAC, wasn't it?
A few miles behind the line, there was some semblance of normality. Life went on in the villages. There were estaminets just like this one, where soldiers could get a drink. There were women. Women were a figment of imagination at ANZAC. And for the Australians, the highest paid soldiers, I think, of the war, they could have a really good time. And in fact, the British hated moving into villages after the Australians had left because they were just unaffordable.
So there was an expectation that this would be probably easier than Gallipoli.
Things were initially quiet, but the contest for no man's land was very even. The Australians didn't get the upper hand at all. The artillery resources dwarfed what was available at Gallipoli, and the German artillery was very accurate, and a barrage or a salvo could arrive just out of the blue. These indications that this is going to be quite a tough theatre are confirmed when raiding starts. The Germans launched the first raids against the Australians, and they come as quite a shock.
Yeah.
But after the experience of Fromelles, and particularly Pozières, the Gallipoli veterans were saying they wished they were back at ANZAC.
In this first raid against the ANZACs, the Germans swept across this field in the Bredouze salient, just outside the village of Bois-Grenier. and even those who'd served on Gallipoli were taken aback. Corporal Arthur Thomas wrote,
"Some fellas' nerves gave way and they became gibbering idiots, sergeants and all sorts. God, it was little wonder. Fighting here is simply a massacre."
The raid on the Australians in the Bordeaux salient was the first action taken against them.
It was the 5th of May, 1916, and it would be a further 920 days before it was all over. At the beginning of the war, the ANZACs were all volunteers, but by the end of it, the Australians were the only full volunteer force remaining in the conflict.
The Australian officers weren't professional soldiers either, and they were under the overall command of British superiors. For 100 years, debate has raised as to whether their commanders could have managed the war more effectively. Were they, in fact, competent men forced to learn on the job, or were they just donkeys leading the lions with outdated tactics?
By 1916, when the ANZACs began arriving on the Western Front, commanders were thinking about new ways and new tools for breaking the trench deadlock. Artillery techniques were being developed, tanks were being developed. At the minor tactical level, trench raids had become commonplace on both sides. They sought to test the opposing defences, identify opposing units, and to capture prisoners who might reveal intelligence that would be useful in the big battles to come.
On the 30th of May, the Germans struck the 11th Battalion from Western Australia in a well-planned and superbly executed raid here at Lacadonnery Farm, just west of Bois-Grenier. The 1st Battalion raised in Queensland, the 9th, was also affected. Both battalions had been among the first ashore at ANZAC, but that experience seemed a long way off here. The Australians had received a short, sharp lesson in just how aggressive and skillful the Germans could be.
The Australians lost 130 men, the Germans only 8, and 6 of those occurred when one of their own grenades exploded accidentally. On the 6th of June, the Australians launched a raid of their own. A 66-strong party attacked in the area of Bois-Grenier on what Captain Alexander Ellis later wrote in his diary was a flat, dank piece of ground about 50 feet above sea level, which pretty much sums up the best part of the Western Front.
Not all men kept personal diaries like Alexander Ellis, but all units from battalion level up kept official diaries that gave accounts of what it was really like on the ground. And of that first Australian offensive action, the war diary of the 28th said, "Day quiet. Our raid on enemy trenches took place. Result of raid, 2 prisoners taken, about 12 killed and 1 seriously wounded. The cost to the battalion, 3 killed, 18 wounded."
10 days later, the New Zealanders launched their first raid. More raids were now being launched in response to the requirement of General Sir Douglas Haig, the British Commander-in-Chief, for an increased offensive tempo to deter the Germans from sending troops from this area further to the south, where a great Anglo-French offensive had been planned for the summer.
In one of those raids on the 25th of June, William Jackson of the 17th Battalion, New South Wales, brought in wounded, incredibly had his arm blown off above the elbow and went out and brought 2 more comrades in. He was awarded Australia's first Victoria Cross of the Western Front, and at 18 remains our youngest ever recipient. Despite the losses, the raids in this part of the line were relatively minor actions. About 300 kilometres to the east, a very different war was being waged, and it had been raging for months.
The French and the Germans were smashing each other to pieces at the great French fortress Verdun. So the French, under extreme pressure, asked the British to take the major role in the upcoming summer offensive.
Haig agreed. The offensive would be launched on that part of the front where the British and French lines joined. It was bisected by a river.
And the name of that river has a loud and enduring echo. This is the Somme.
On Z Day, July 1st, 1916, under a cloudless blue sky which gave full promise of the hot midsummer day which was ahead, 13 British divisions attacked on a 24-kilometre front, with 5 French divisions supporting the advance on the right flank. The attack followed a week-long bombardment in which 1.5 million shells had pummeled the German position, and mines had been detonated.
And this is the 300-foot wide crater made by one of those mines. What the Allies did was that they tunnelled underneath what was a hill here, laid 60,000 pounds of explosives, and when it was detonated, it sent debris 4,000 feet into the air.
The first day on the Somme, in which thankfully no ANZAC formations were involved, was the bloodiest day in the history of the British Army. It was a gloriously sunny day, just like this. And attacking across these fields, the British sustained 57,500 casualties, 20,000 of them killed.
And on that terrible day, 3 ANZAC battalions launched coordinated raids here in an effort to prevent the Germans from sending potential reinforcements to the main battlefield further to the south.
And for several weeks the raids continued, often with heavy losses.
Imagine the German line running across about 200 metres behind me. The open ground between it and this road where I'm standing is no man's land. It's the 13th of July, and New Zealand's 1st Otago Battalion is launching a raid across no man's land on the German line.
175 men advanced across this open ground, and they didn't even get close to the German trenches where I'm standing before they were all but wiped out.
Despite the ANZACs having yet to fight a major battle, casualties by this time exceeded 2,300 among the Australians and 2,200 among the New Zealanders.
The idea that this was heaven after hell hadn't lasted long, and it was about to get a whole lot worse.
Because against expectation, the Battle of the Somme wasn't decisive and went grinding on for weeks. So the British decided that something more than raiding was needed to distract the Germans.
The 5th Australian Division had only just arrived on the Western Front, the last of the Australian divisions to do so, when on the 19th of July, it became the first of them to see major offensive action on the Western Front.
And in that first engagement, the Australians were torn to shreds. From this village, German observers could see a broad, flat plain with trees blasted away, crops untended. They could also see the British and the Australians building for an attack. And when that attack came, machine gun positions just below the village ripped right into it. This is Fromelles.
It's the 19th of July 1916, and the ANZACs are about to attack Fromelles. Although they'd experienced raiding, they'd yet to engage in their first major battle on the Western Front. And after seeing the ground on which it would be fought, Major Henry Howard predicted a bloody Holocaust. And he was right.
German troops from the Fromelles area have been identified on the Somme, and the British High Command wants an operation laid on to discourage the Germans from sending any more of them there.
A force of 10,000, 2/3 of them Australians, are to attack a German position. Defenders, roughly equal strength.
The 5th Australian Division is on the left, the British 61st Division on the right. But the Germans are well dug in at and on either side of the Sugarloaf, a salient jutting into no man's land into which they could fire from both sides. And they've also strengthened the Sugarloaf with concrete machine gun emplacements.
Now, any battle, even a diversionary one, needs an objective on the ground, and the objective here, basically for the sake of having one, was a line of German support trenches 200 metres beyond their front line.
The bombardment lasts 11 hours, and then, in the early evening of 19 July 1916, the troops went over the top.
And Thomas Brain of the 59th Battalion recalled what happened next.
Somewhere about 5 o'clock, the artillery over that. And my mate, all of a sudden, he fell over on top of me. I said, "Get up, you had your breakfast this morning." And I had a look at him. All his back and through to his stomach was all gone.
In a single night, the 5th Division suffered more than 5,500 casualties, 1,917 killed, and almost 1,300 of them with no known grave. As Lieutenant Hugh Knivet wrote, if you had gathered the stock of 1,000 butcher shops, it would give you a faint conception of the shambles those trenches were.
The 6th Bavarian Division facing the Australians had held this part of the line for a year. They knew the ground intimately and they'd created a formidable defence on it. One of the men in the division was Lance Corporal Adolf Hitler, and it's said that he sheltered in this bunker.
About 200 metres behind me across this field was the Sugarloaf salient, from which the German machine gunners commanded this tremendous field of fire.
The military terms are enfilade fire and grazing fire. For attacking troops, enfilade fire comes from the flanks and sweeps along the assaulting line. Grazing fire means that the centre of each burst doesn't rise above the height of a standing man, so very little went over the diggers' heads. The Germans at the Sugarloaf not only caught the Australians in enfilade, but they could also engage them with grazing fire. It was a machine gunner's dream.
26-year-old Major Jeff McRae wrote to his family, "Today I lead my battalion in an assault on the German lines, and I pray God I may come through all right and bring honour to our name. If not, I will at least have laid down my life for you and my country, which is the greatest privilege one can ask for. Farewell, dear people, the hour approacheth." McRae did indeed lead his battalion, and with most of his battalion, he died.
The 15th Brigade had been mowed down in front of the Sugarloaf, but the rest of the Australian attack, initially at least, had fared better. The 53rd Battalion, mainly from the suburbs of Sydney and led by a 21-year-old, after its commanding officer had been killed, was advancing in intermittent contact with the 54th Battalion, also New South Welsh, on its left flank, and expecting to link up with the 15th Brigade on its right flank.
There was almost nothing left of the 15th, and the British 61st Division on its right, having been mauled by German machine guns and finding that the bombardment had made virtually no impression on the barbed wire, was forced to withdraw.
The right flank of the 53rd Battalion was therefore open, and it soon came under relentless attack from the Germans.
The unit diary of the 53rd reported that touch was obtained with the 54th on our left, but no one could be found on our right. Positions were held throughout the night against violent attacks when the orders were received to retire from the positions won, and our right flank being in the air, the enemy managed to turn it and establish themselves to the rear of our right.
The commanding officer of the 54th Battalion, Lieutenant Colonel Walter Cass, sent what might well be described as a somewhat understated signal. It said, "Position almost desperate." The 32nd Battalion, anchoring the left flank, was in tenuous contact with the 31st, but the 31st was largely out of touch with the 54th Battalion on its right. The war diary of the 31st Battalion later reported information supplied as to enemy defences was largely incorrect and misleading. Heavy and continuous German counterattacks forced the 5th Australian Division back to its own line by morning.
When it was all over, the 22-year-old law student, Sergeant Walter Dowling of the 57th wrote, "A valley of death fuelled by somebody's blunder. The sandbags were splashed with red. Red were the fire steps, the duckboards, the bays. And the stench of stagnant pools of heroes' blood is in our nostrils even now."
After the battle, the Australians scoured no man's land for their wounded. And Sergeant Simon Fraser, a Victorian farmer, wrote,
"I heard this fellow calling out with a big wound in his thigh. I managed to get him into an old trench, then another man sang out, 'Don't forget me, cobber.' This monument at Fromelles is dedicated to that moment."
After Fromelles, Corporal Harold Harris, also a pre-war farmer, wrote, "By hell, we caught it." And those who think this war is nearly over are in for some surprises.
And indeed they were. Barely had the echo of the guns silenced over Fromelles than the ANZACs were into action to its south, where the Battle of the Somme was continuing. And over a period of 45 days, they took 23,000 casualties.
In the next episode, we follow their story on the Somme, where the Australians would add a new and unforgettable name to their battle honours. This place, Pozières.